The Tudor History and Travel Show is a podcast that brings Tudor history to life by exploring Tudor places and artefacts in the flesh. You will be travelling through time with Sarah Morris, the Tudor Travel Guide, uncovering the stories behind some of the most amazing Tudor locations and objects in the UK. Because when you visit a Tudor building, it is only time and not space which separates you from the past. And now over to your host, Sarah Morris.
Hello, it's Sarah, the Tudor Travel Guide here. Welcome to this month's episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. This is just a note to say that if you are hearing this, then you are not currently part of my membership programme and will only be hearing the first part of each show. In order to access full episodes of the Tudor History and Travel Show, you will need to become a member of my membership site, The Ultimate Guide to Exploring Tudor England, via the link in the description associated with this podcast. Welcome, my time-travelling friends. Today we have travelled to the county of Gloucestershire, and I have come to a building I know well. I've done many reenactments here. It is the beautiful Berkeley Castle, which has so much history, both medieval, Tudor, and of course beyond. Now, today we are going to be focusing on some of the medieval history, which has a fair amount of controversy and bloodshed involved, as well as talking about its Tudor connections, because there was a period of time at Berkeley when the castle came into the ownership of the Crown and was visited on a number of occasions by some splendid royal visitors. But we have a guide, as ever today, to help us on our way and to navigate us through the history of Berkeley, which goes somewhat 900 or so years. Jane, welcome. Thank you so much for being our guide today.
That's a pleasure. Welcome to Berkeley Castle.
Oh, thank you. Well, we are in splendid surroundings here in the Inner Bailey, aren't we?
We are, yes, and it must be one of the very few intact, complete, almost original inner baileys, inner courtyards of any castle in the country, because this castle is one of the very few that are still inhabited and habitable and complete.
And complete, fully intact, yeah. I mean, I think as I've been researching Berkeley over the years, I think one of the things that has always struck me is that the kind of footprint of the castle, it hasn't changed in recent times. The interiors might have changed a little bit, but the actual footprint of the castle is pretty much, isn't it, how it's been over centuries. And certainly as the Tudors would have known it.
It certainly is, and I think that's what attracts a lot of filmmakers, perhaps,
yes.
here. They see this courtyard and they think, gosh, what we can do with this. And incidentally, just very recently, we've had a film crew here filming the next part of Wolf Hall, which is, of course, very Tudor. I think it's the last book of Hilary Mantel's trilogy with the downfall of Thomas Cromwell. And yes, they've been here and filmed here. And you can, looking around, you can understand why we're so popular, I think.
Yes, well, just this is a good point for me to say, dear listeners, that there will be a show notes page associated with this podcast, and I'll put some photos of the castle so that you can see some of the things that Jane and I are going to be talking about as we go round. So make sure that you look out for the link, as ever, in the description below or associated with the podcast. Now, I didn't ask you to introduce yourself, Jane, so what do you do here at Berkeley?
My name's Jane Handoll. I've lived in Berkeley for 17 years, and I guide here at the castle when we're open, which is 7 months of the year. We're about to open this coming weekend, and we'll be open till the end of October to visitors. And I lead tours around the castle.
So perfect.
Yes, it's a very addictive place, I think we could say. We all love doing it. Some of us have been doing it for quite a long time. No, it's a privilege to be able to take people around and tell them about and show them centuries of history that have gone on here.
Well, that's a good cue, actually, into me asking about the kind of foundation of the castle. How old is it, and how did it come to be here?
Well, the stone castle, the keep in the one corner of the bailey, the courtyard, dates from the middle of the 12th century. There was probably an earlier Motte and Bailey castle here. The castle itself would have been built of wood, and it would have been put up probably towards the end of the 11th century, because that's what William the Conqueror did. He sent his people out to colonise, to stabilise the country by building castles pretty well everywhere. Apparently, back in the day, Gloucestershire alone had 28 castles.
Right.
There are now 2 that I can think of and a few ruins, but it just shows what a huge building programme it was. But a wooden castle is a bit like a chocolate teapot. It doesn't last very long. It can be burnt, it can be hacked down, it rots. And so in the middle of the 12th century, the honour of Berkeley was given to a Bristol merchant, Robert Fitzhardinge, by the first Plantagenet King, Henry II. And the reason that he favoured Robert Fitzhardinge was that Fitzhardinge had supported Henry and his mother Matilda during the anarchy period, when the country was at war with itself, the battles between the cousins Stephen and Matilda. And Fitzhardinge had bankrolled Henry.
Right.
And so he was rewarded when Henry came to the throne in 1154. So Robert Fitzhardinge began building this great stone keep. This is a circular keep. It's known as a shell keep, whereas some stone keeps, round keeps, were built on top of mounds. Think of Windsor Castle, think of Clifford's Tower in York. This one is built around the mound, so it encircles the mound. The man-made motte, is within it. It means it's that much stronger. There is no ground floor to this keep, because that's just solid earth and stone.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. I mean, we will be going up the flight of staircase shortly, but it hadn't dawned on me that actually there was no ground floor. Interesting.
Yes. Now, this was a good place to build a castle. We're exactly halfway between Bristol to the south and Gloucester to the north, and we're almost on the banks of the River Severn, which was the great highway of the medieval period, and beyond were the Welsh. And so it was an important castle to keep out those barbarians and to defend the Forest of Dean, which was a great royal hunting forest, and generally to keep an eye on the traffic up and down the river.
Let's just step away from our exploration of Berkeley Castle just for a moment, because I wanted to let you know that the first of our 2025 tours for the Simply Tudor Tours tour portfolio is now open for booking. Yay! The tour is called Anne and Elizabeth, Mother, Daughter, Traitors, Queens, and will be running between the 19th of May and the 27th of May 2025. We have a wonderful, immersive itinerary available for this tour. But rather than telling you all about it here, you can find everything that you need to know over on the Simply Tudor Tours website. And I will put a link in the description associated with this podcast, where you can go and find out all the information that you need, and indeed, if you wish, to make a booking. I also want to add here that this is the first of 3 tours that we are running as part of our tour portfolio in 2025. There will be The Year That Shook the Tudor Throne, the 1502 progress of Elizabeth of York and Henry VII, which will be running in July 2025, and also The Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn, running again in September next year. An overview of all our current tours are available on the Simply Tudor Tours website. Simply head over to the homepage and click the drop-down menu to find our tours. Okay, well, I think that's all I need to say for now. Maybe I'll see you in person on the road. That would be fabulous. But for now, let's head over back to Berkeley Castle.
Did the family was it Fitzharding, did you
Yes.
say? Fitzharding. Were they titled at that point? You said he came from basically almost a mercantile class. So
Yes,
this was a big elevation for
He was a
him.
merchant. They weren't an ennobled family, but he was wealthy and had supported Henry. But once the castle had been, or the keep was underway, then the family was elevated and they became the barons of Berkeley, and they took the name of the place where they built the castle. So instead of being Fitzhardings, they became de Berkeleys after that.
And so that is where obviously the family name today, I mean, it still continues, doesn't it?
It is, because this is one of the very few castles in England that is still owned and occupied by the family who built it. There's been a continuous ownership and occupation over nearly 900 years now. And I think it's about 28 generations that it comes down to the present Berkeleys who still live here today.
That's awesome, isn't it? This is a bit
I
mind-blowing,
think they're
really.
only rivalled by the royal family at Windsor.
Is that so? Okay, well, not bad. Not bad rivals. Okay, so I'd love to go into the keep. Now, one of the things I think most visitors will associate with Berkeley is this dark period associated with the murder of an English king, Edward II. And this supposedly happened here, right?
Exactly, yes.
So I'd love to go inside because I know you've got some very special spaces, and maybe you could tell us a little bit of how the Berkeley family developed to that point and how that whole episode came about. Would that be okay?
Yes, that's fine. Just to tell you first that this courtyard, when the keep was built, so in the 1200s and the 1300s, this courtyard would have been bigger. There would just have been the keep, which was for a garrison and prisoners and the like. And there would have been temporary buildings in the bailey, in the courtyard. But in the 14th century, the Fitzhardings, the de Berkeleys wanted to spend more time here. And so these ranges of buildings all the way around the courtyard were added. They're just really a room deep. And but it gave them a permanent great hall, a chapel, bedchambers, permanent kitchens, and the like. So we've had a second building period in the 14th century.
That makes a lot of sense. So that's how the castle that we see today, that's when it really came
as
into
a family
being.
home. As a family home, really. And then there was another building period in the 20th century, this wonderful porch we'll come out of at the end. This was added, believe it or not, barely 100 years ago. The 8th Earl of Berkeley came to live here in 1916. The place was in a rather parlous, run-down state, not really very comfortable for an Earl of the realm, and he set about restoring it, improving it, making it comfortable. He wanted a grand entrance, and he built this wonderful porch in the corner of the bailey. He was a great collector of architectural salvage, and he wanted it to look as though it had always been there. And I think he pretty well succeeded.
Yeah.
He collected bits and pieces of windows and doors and carvings and stonework, all sorts of things from all over. And that was at the period at the end of the Great War. He came here in 1916. And of course, in Northern Europe, there must have been rich pickings of wonderful buildings, churches, manor houses that had been almost totally destroyed, and they would have been glad to get rid of a few of their bits and pieces, I should think, for a few francs.
Yeah. Well, he did a good job, I have to say. I'm very picky about renovations, but actually...
Yeah, well, I might mention him as we go around because he pops up all over the place.
Okay, now we're going to go in, aren't we? And we're going to pick up this story of Berkeley's early medieval past.
Yes. Well, of course, when it was built, this was built as a defensive castle. That was its function, that was its purpose. Of course, over 900 years, that's changed. We no longer need this castle to keep the Welsh out and defend the realm. But of course, we still have a lot of those defensive features here. As you come in through the gatehouse, there would have been a portcullis there. There's double doors and then a portcullis. There are arrow slits all around, battlements where soldiers could have been positioned with crossbows and bows and arrows and the like. And then we have humble trip steps.
Oh, yes.
This flight of stairs, they're uneven. Now, part of it inevitably is wear and tear, but we're told that these were built like this, different heights, to foil the enemy. So if this castle was being attacked, the enemy would rush up here and they wouldn't have been told to watch their step and they would fall over themselves and hopefully could then be picked off by soldiers in the room above. In addition, over the third step, we have a murder hole.
Oh yes, so you do.
And so nasty things would have been hurled down on their heads, sticks, stones, hot sand, boiling water, possibly the contents of slot buckets and chamber pots.
I can imagine.
This is a warm welcome to Berkeley Castle.
Absolutely.
And please mind your step as you go, because they do still work.
Yes, I'm glad it's not quite so contentious this morning as we're going up these stairs. It's a lovely flight of stairs, though, but any little advantage? I see this big step here that you've got to just...
Yes.
Get...
It's all right when you know about it,
yes.
but we do get a number of people who do stumble.
And then you've got this, just as we're about to enter the keep, this gorgeous, it's Normanesque, that, isn't it?
It's very Norman, yes. Yeah. Sadly, we've lost one of our carved pillars, but it's the most beautiful doorway and certainly pinpoints this as a late Norman castle keep. Yeah. Now, we've come up the stairs underneath this forebuilding. Now, this forebuilding originally, we believe, was the guard room. But it's in this building in 1327 that Berkeley's most famous prisoner was incarcerated.
Tell us the story. How did it all... Well, I've already mentioned who it was. It was a king of England, but how did it all happen?
It was King Edward II, or by the time he came here, he was actually the father of the king because he'd been deposed. Edward II, the son of Edward I, that great hammer of the Scots, that great warrior king, he was actually the first English Prince of Wales, born in Carnarvon Castle, but he was very unlike his father, and his father must have been very disappointed in him, I think.
Oh, right. Yes.
Whereas his father went into battle and won them, Edward didn't win them. He preferred the life of the court. He had an entourage of young men favourites at court, which upset the barons because the barons were being pushed out and their land was being taken and given to Edward's favourites. It upset the Queen because she didn't see much of a husband and he was preferred the company of these young men. So in the 1320s there was a lot of civil disobedience, and Queen Isabella left for France, her native country, with her eldest son. And there she met up with Roger Mortimer, who was the leader of the Barons faction. They teamed up in all senses of the word. They became lovers, and they raised an army and brought it back to England. And in 1326, Edward II and his supporters were defeated. He was forced to abdicate, and his young son was crowned Edward III. He was only about 15 at the time, and so he was really a puppet king under Mortimer and Queen Isabella. So you replace one regime with another. And Edward was brought here to Berkeley Castle. Now, I think there are two main reasons for that. Firstly, we're way out west. We're off the beaten track. He was held first at Kenilworth, which is right in the middle of the country on the Great North Road. But here even today, a lot of people don't really know about us. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, Thomas Berkeley, who owned the castle at the time, was the son-in-law of Roger Mortimer, the leader of the Barons faction. And so if you keep it in the family, you're more certain of Edward not being allowed to escape or bribed or anything like that.
Can we have a look at the room itself?
We can't go in, but we can look in.
So let's
follow
do that.
me
Okay.
into the keep.
And then we can pick up the story as delicately as we possibly can.
Now, back in the medieval period, this would not have looked like this. We'd have actually walked directly into the garden or the courtyard.
Ah, I see.
This work here, this gallery, known as the King's Gallery, this was the 8th Earl's construction. He built it to give more accommodation within the keep. There are bedrooms and bathrooms above for servants, for staff. And it was a lovely gallery to show off his paintings and to make the most of Edward's cell.
Right,
now,
yes.
he also punched a hole in the wall here so that we can look into the cell, which was originally, as I said, the guardroom. And we can see it's not bad, really. I mean, you think of a medieval prison, and you think of something more dank and dark and
You do.
gloomy.
I could take up residence in there quite.
Well, I think all of us have stayed in hotel rooms that are possibly not quite as nice as that.
Yeah. So he was brought here. What happened?
He was actually well looked after to begin with, or during most of his stay. He was held in honourable captivity because although he'd been deposed, he was of royal birth. Kings are anointed by God, and therefore you get rid of them at your peril. And so there are references in the accounts, in the archives, for extra food, extra servants. He would have had his own priest. He would have had his own servants. They had use of the kitchens, making his food, his bread, his meat, and so on. But it didn't end well for Edward here. After about 5-6 months, by September 1327, he was still alive. And of course, an alive ex-king is a threat. And so we presume it was Roger Mortimer who gave the order that he should be dispatched. And on the night of the 21st of September, Edward died here, we believe, we're told, in this cell. Now, I don't think there are many contraries to that. What isn't exactly known is the manner of his going. Now, they didn't want to leave any mark on the body that he'd been tampered with in any way, because to kill a king was sacrilegious as well as treasonable. And so they had to they couldn't cut his head off, they couldn't stab him, they couldn't strangle him. So he may well have been suffocated. But documents did appear some time later suggesting that he may have been run through up his fundament with a red-hot poker or red-hot piece of iron. Now, I don't think that's impossible. You think of the tortures and the deaths that pertained during the medieval period, disemboweling alive, hanging, drawing, quartering, on the rack and the rest. But I don't know.
We don't know. Fundamentally, we don't know, but I agree with you. I think the Times were absolutely capable of doing something like that.
I think the probability is that he was probably suffocated.
Yeah.
But of course, it's the dramatic, rather gruesome story that's come down through the ages, so that the likes of Christopher Marlowe wrote a play, Edward II, and it ends with that gruesome, dramatic scene of him being thrust on a table with a red-hot iron. Anyway. Yes.
Of course, I should say that there are people, because occasionally I post about this incident, particularly when I go to Gloucester Cathedral and I do a reel of his tomb, and invariably I get a number of people saying, oh, well, I don't think he was murdered, I don't think it's proven, I think he escaped. What do you think about that? What this?
I think in history as well as in life, it's usually the simple answer. I think he probably died here. I have read, yes, the stories, the books about him escaping from here, wandering across Europe as a mendicant monk and ending his days that way. It's a bit like the princes in the tower, isn't it?
Yes.
Were they killed there? Were they killed? Did they escape?
Who
what
knows?
happened? I just think history, like life, is usually the simple option. So I think he probably died here, but I don't know.
Yeah,
I
Occam's
don't know.
razor it's called, isn't it? The most obvious explanation is the explanation.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, well, there you go. So I would say to those people that if you are coming to Berkeley Castle, which of course you should, and we'll be talking about how to come and visit and how to get information towards the end of this podcast, do make sure also that you pop along to Gloucester Cathedral, which is not a million miles away, and see one of the most fantastic cathedrals and cloisters you are going to see anywhere, but you'll also see the exquisite tomb of Edward II, which is truly beautiful.
Yes, it is. So after Edward died in September 1327, I believe he lay here for a while. I think they probably thought, now what do we do with him?
Oh, right, yeah.
And eventually he was taken from here on a cart, the 15 miles or so north to Gloucester. Gloucester was not a cathedral then, it was St. Peter's Abbey. And of course, abbeys in the medieval period, they earned their income very largely by having relics or interesting things on their premises that pilgrims would come and look at and pay money to see. And so actually an ex-king was quite a find for them, I think. And it's funny how unpopular as he'd been in life, and we're the same today, aren't we?
Yes.
We celebrate this sort of thing. It's a bit gruesome, but we like to come and see where he ended up. So it made Gloucester Abbey, St. Peter's Abbey, very wealthy.
It did, didn't it? They got a lot of pilgrims. It really kind of shot up in terms
a bit like
of
tourism today, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so they were able to rebuild the abbey into what we now have, as you say, one of the finest cathedrals in the country.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And I believe it was saved at the Reformation by Henry VIII would not have it destroyed because one of his ancestors was buried there. Strangely, off this medieval keep, we've got a Tudor bedroom. Now, of course, this is because over the passage of centuries, the castle has evolved, and so little bits have been put here and there. It's said that Sir Francis Drake, who was a favourite courtier of Queen Elizabeth I, used to visit Berkeley Castle. Again, we don't have any absolute evidence for that. But he would have visited the Forest of Dean looking for timber for his shipping, and I believe one of his great sponsors lived across the River Severn. So it's possible that he stopped off here and spent the night occasionally on his travels on land. So we've got a room here we call Drake's room. I don't suspect that he actually slept in this room, even if he did visit the castle, but we do have a very lovely,
it's beautiful, isn't it?
16th century four-poster or tester bed in this room, finely carved, inlaid. It's a very lovely piece. And on the wall, we have a piece of embroidery, which was a bedspread. And it's said that this covered the bed that Queen Elizabeth I slept in when she visited Berkeley Castle in 1575 or so. I'm not sure again about the dates, but
has it been tested for its age?
I believe so. I believe the Royal School of Needlework, which I think is at Hampton Court Palace.
Yes, at Hampton Court Palace. Yes.
I think they have looked at it and they possibly think that it's a bit later. But again, it's a very lovely piece.
It's a lovely story, yes.
Not now on the bed, but behind perspex on the wall. And we do have some portraits in this room, some very, very colourful portraits of characters who were alive during the Tudor period. The central one of those is a lady, and it's said that it's Lucy Harrington, wife of of Edward Russell, Earl of Bedford. But our curator has done some research and believes that this may be Elizabeth Carey, who was a fairly well-known Tudor lady. We'll meet her grandfather in a little while, because Elizabeth, this is a portrait of a lady in very colourful costume, supposedly performing in a masque around 1600. And it's known that Elizabeth Carey she was interested in drama and that she did appear in masks. So Josh believes that could well be Elizabeth Carey. It's the trouble with portraits, sometimes they've got titles and you can't be certain that it's the right
one that's been added at the bottom.
Yes.
Now is a good time to talk about, we were talking about Edward II from sort of mid-1300s, and we've fast-forwarded a bit by kind of 150 years, but there's a very interesting episode for me in Berkeley's history where it for a period, I think, of about 60 years, it leaves the Berkeley family.
That's right.
And it passes into the hands of the crown, and this is during the reign of Henry VII, and I've read about this, I know about this, but I wonder if you could fill in any more detail about exactly why that happened. I can't imagine it would have made for a very easy family conversation as the family inheritance is passed off to somebody else. But can you tell us the story?
Yes, it involved William Lord Berkeley towards the end of the 15th century. And he died, or had no children. He died without issue. He had a brother who was due to inherit. Didn't like his brother very much, and he wanted to spite him. So rather than die and the castle going automatically to his next of kin, his brother, he gave the castle away to the new Tudor dynasty, to the new king, Henry VII. This was in the early 1490s, and he didn't do it totally out of the goodness of his heart. He got something in exchange. So he was a baron, he was Baron Berkeley, and he became, I think, Marquis of Nottingham, and he had other various titles important at court and so on. So during his later lifetime, he was elevated, and he spited, his brothers. So I think that's the background.
That makes sense. How to annoy your family. Well, I thought that must have happened, and that's obviously exactly the intention. So Berkeley then passed into the hands of the crown, and this is where we start really getting into the Tudor history. And I know we're going to continue our walk and talk tour and take us into some of perhaps the most exciting parts of the building, particularly when you think of royal progresses and royal visitors coming here and the spaces that they may have stayed in. So are we going to walk in that direction, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about some of the royal visits that have happened here?
Yes, I mean, we tend to associate Berkeley Castle, being a medieval castle, with all things medieval, but it's interesting, as you say, when you scratch the surface, and it's been here so long, there is a wealth of Tudor and later connections as well. I mean, and then going beyond that, Georgians and of course other things like that. So yes, this castle certainly spans the whole range of English history. We're going to go down through this little archway, down some steps. Do be careful, they can be a bit slippery.
Well, those fantastic, gorgeous little sort of late
Well, this leads from what we call the King's Gallery through the Tower Room, which was otherwise known as a ladies' hold in medieval period. If the castle was under attack, then the women, children, any elderly people could shelter in this tower room. And this little doorway, this narrow doorway, could be defended by just one soldier. Big doors are not a good idea because lots of people can get through. Yeah. Narrow doorways and narrow passageways are good because they're easily defended.
Good point. Excellent. So, dear listeners, if you're thinking of building a castle, remember, put in your narrow doorway. We're just making our way, as you can hear, down some flights of stairs and into what is distinctly, it feels to me, much more Georgian in its sort of feel, this room to me.
Yes, well, we've now walked into the 14th century because we're in the ranges of buildings that were built around the courtyard in the 1300s. And many of these spaces have changed their function over the centuries. This room that we're in, we call it the picture gallery because it's got a lot of pictures in it. This was divided into three at one time. This was either nurseries or bedrooms for young men in the family. And with some wonderful paintings in here. A lot of them naval paintings or seascapes because the Berkeley family over the years have been involved with the Royal Navy. Many of the particularly younger sons have joined the Navy right up until the 19th, even the 20th century. And so we have some very fine paintings here.
I love the pictures, though, of the castles. You've got two or three of the castle itself.
Yes, this is a wonderful one. This puts the castle very definitely in the landscape. It dates from about 1699. So post-Civil War, when the castle was attacked and taken over by the parliamentarian forces and then saved by George Berkeley, who had to breach the castle wall to make it indefensible, but otherwise the castle was left alone. And you can see the castle on its natural bit of high ground above the meadows, which are water meadows. These would have flooded very readily back in the day before a lot of flood defences and so on. Actually, looking around at the outline.
We need it.
A lot of these are flooded today after the winter we've had. Yes. But you can see the castle there on its bit of high ground, the River Severn and the hills of Wales in the background.
Now, this is really interesting to me, and I know we're going to talk about royal visits and progresses. I'm currently writing about the 1502 progress of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, who set off, for those of you who don't know and haven't heard me talk about this, I know I've been talking a lot on Instagram in particular, they set out from Woodstock, they set out from London, but the part of the progress to southeast Wales goes from Woodstock, goes through Gloucestershire, through the Forest of Dean, down towards Raglan Castle, and then they make their way back via Chepstow and Wollaston. Now, I found out Wollaston before they came to Berkeley, and I found out Wollaston is somewhere on the other side.
Oh, I don't know.
Of the estuary. And I had never seen this before. I love the fact you've got this picture of Berkeley, you've got the fields, and you've got the Severn, and then you say you can see Wales, well, you can see the other side of the Severn and the hills of Wales. And I know, because I've studied the Google Maps on this, that Wollaston is somewhere just over on that side.
Is it near Lydney?
Yes, I think it is.
Lydney's pretty well here, I think.
So I think, and it's a very short hop across the estuary and then across the fields.
You have to time it right, though.
Yes,
make sure you're not coinciding with the Severn Bore twice a day.
What's the Severn Bore? Explain to everybody.
The Severn Bore is a great wave that comes in with the tide, so it comes in twice a day. Now, the Bristol Channel narrows down very rapidly, becoming the Severn estuary and then becoming the River Severn at Gloucester. And it's a phenomenon that happens when water is channeled very rapidly from wide to narrow, and a wave builds up as the tide comes in.
How interesting.
And just this last week, we've had a 5-star bore, apparently.
Have you?
And you get surfers and canoeists.
Is that so?
Oh, yes. And that people come from miles around to have a look at this amazing rise of the water. I have seen it. It can be spectacular. If there isn't a great wave that you can surf on, you stand on the bank and 1 minute the water's, 10 foot down.
Yes.
The next minute it's lapping around your ankles and you kind of, you've blinked and you've almost missed it. So there are also quite treacherous sandbars and sandbanks going up the River Severn. And so they would have to have
know what they were doing.
Oh yes, but boatmen in those days, they would have known.
There's records, and not that particular one, but down at Chepstow there was records of money being paid to the mariners who conveyed them across.
Well, of course, it's wider to get across at Chepstow, and we now have 2 bridges.
Yeah, well, indeed.
But in the 20th century, but yes, they would have crossed by boat.
Yes. Interesting, fascinating. So look, we're talking about Henry VII now, and this is the king who took hold of Berkeley. I'm writing about the 1502 progress, but I understand he came here earlier than that as well.
Well, I've been told that he spent Christmas 1495 here.
Okay.
So
I've not looked into it, but
there's another bit of
curious.
research to do.
It makes sense, though, doesn't it, that he came, certainly, because he's acquired this new castle, and now I'm thinking, of course, that's why he would come on his way back here, because...
Well, he was coming home, wasn't he?
Coming home, chance to sort of, you put your feet up and make yourself at home. That's fantastic.
Interestingly, when Henry VII and Henry VIII owned the castle, of course, the Berkeleys still lived here as stewards, and it must have been quite galling to be told by your new masters that, to mend the fences in the deer park and to make sure that the chimneys were swept or whatever. It must have been a bit hard to be bossed around by a new landlord.
That's interesting. I had wondered what happened to the Berkeley family, whether they'd shipped out. No, they stayed put during that period. I think
there are quite a lot of letters. I think there is certainly at least one letter I've heard about or seen in the archives from Henry VIII to whichever Berkeley it was, it may have been Henry Berkeley, telling him to mend the palings, the fences in the deer park, because the deer were getting out. And of course, Henry would come here and he would love to go on go hunting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's important to him.
Come here, he did. Shall we carry on into perhaps carry on down? We're going down another couple of flights of stairs.
This space that we're entering now is a bit of an indeterminate space. To look at it, you'd think it was a dining room. We've got a large dining table in the centre of it. But actually, rolling back the centuries, this is where the postern gate came through. So this would have been a gatehouse, stabling for horses and so on. Then we think, possibly in the Tudor period, this may have been the servants' hall. There's evidence in these archways here that there's been some kind of a screen, and dining halls would have been separated by a screen, and there's a passageway behind. We've got the larders and the kitchens beyond.
Yes.
But this would never have been a dining room for the family and their guests. We're on the north side of the castle. We're right by the larders. This was the inferior side. It's okay for the servants, but not okay for the family here. They would always have dined in the Great Hall, or perhaps in the 19th century, up in one of the upper rooms. There's a more intimate dining room. But I just would like to show you something. Our recent interpretation for this season is to outline what members of the family might have eaten depending on their century that they lived in. And we start with Robert Fitzharding, so in the 12th century, and then we move on through the various centuries. And we come to the secret witness.
I recognise this name. Yes.
And this was Anne Savage. Now, she was a fairly humble-born lady in the 16th century. She came from a Cheshire family, I believe, and she became one of Anne Boleyn's ladies in waiting at the time when Henry was wooing her. And Anne witnessed the secret marriage of Anne Boleyn and King Henry VIII in January 1533. She was rewarded, and she was obviously told to keep her mouth shut, and she was rewarded for so doing, by being married off into the nobility. She was married to Thomas Berkeley, Lord Thomas Berkeley. And according to our interpretation here, she would have eaten salmon salad or salet on a wooden trencher. So it's a really lovely interpretation with the various different kinds of foods.
I'm so glad Anne makes it onto here, because to me, she is one of the intriguing characters in Anne Boleyn's story. I know we were having a quick chat before we started recording, because when I was writing my novel, Le Temps Viendra, a novel of Anne Boleyn, and I was writing about that ceremony, obviously you come across Anne Savage as being listed in one account as being, I think, the only female witness to the union. And I was always fascinated because her name doesn't really crop up in Anne Boleyn's circle generally, either before or after. And in fact, I think I remember reading that, and this will tally with what you're saying, that she kind of leaves court, doesn't really come up again. Now, maybe I have missed something, but it felt that she appeared in a very important episode in Anne's life from nowhere almost, and I'm endlessly intrigued as to how Anne Savage made it to be one of that handful of witnesses in that sort of in private secret event. I'd love to know more.
I'm afraid I can't really help you, but there may well be something in the Berkeley archives. The archives here at the castle are one of the largest collection of documents, letters and so on of any family, any castle in the country. It's a huge resource. Wow. And they're still finding things. So if you dig, you might find. Her marriage to Thomas Berkeley was quite short-lived. She had a daughter, and then she was pregnant again. But before her son, Henry Berkeley, named after the king, was born, her husband died. And she apparently refused to remarry, which would have been the normal thing for a lady in those days, probably another arranged marriage. She's probably just stayed on here managing her son's estates.
Well, I think it was not an unwise move. I think it was one of those positions that women actually had some freedom. If you were a widow and you become basically a woman, an independent woman of means.
And when you think of the Tudor court under Henry VIII, perhaps you were wise to keep out of it. I mean, a rash word or an action that could be misinterpreted could lead to a sticky end.
Yeah, I mean, this definitely fits with what I found out when I was researching, that she kind of left court and didn't really go back. She stayed away. Obviously, she decided, it was almost as if witnessing Anne's marriage was like, okay, I've seen enough, I've done enough, I'm just going to get out of the way now. It's really interesting. I'd love to know more.
Especially when 3 years later she saw what happened to her. Well, so anybody who might have supported the ex-queen might have been, in danger.
Interesting. Yes. Okay,
we're going to walk now through the larders and through the medieval kitchens. Careful, there are steps up and down.
Okay, so thank you.
Watch your step.
Your kitchens are amazing. They're so...
Yes, they're divided into two. We first walk into what we call the buttery, which is really I'd call it the scullery, really, because it's where the washing up was done and the preparation of food, the bread ovens. The well was under the courtyard. You accessed it down a very steep set of stairs and a passageway, and then water would have been heated on the fire and so on. But the main kitchen is a hexagonal building.
Which was not uncommon. I've seen a number of, I'm thinking of Cowdray House for one, that immediately jumps into mind. That this doesn't seem to be a totally unusual arrangement, but it's got a real authentic feel to it, hasn't it?
Yes.
Although I imagine some of this is later.
I think the spit where the meat was cooked, that's probably dates around 1700. So I'm not quite sure what they would have had before. We think that this kitchen was freestanding originally, which figures because in medieval times or Tudor times even, the risk of fire was huge, and you didn't want your kitchens so attached to your great hall or your other buildings that if fire broke out it could spread. Over the centuries, over the years, it's been sort of incorporated into the rest of the castle. There were 3 fireplaces in here because, of course, as you know, different dishes needed different temperatures, different kinds of cooking, so you couldn't do it all on one fire.
Right, yes.
But we still have this spit here. And this is not a manual spit, this was self-propelling, so it's quite interesting. There was a plate or sort of fan in the chimney breast that was turned by the rising hot air from the fire. And that was connected to some cogs, connected to a pulley, which turned the spit.
That's
so it
clever.
meant you didn't need a spit boy to turn it, but as long as you kept a good updraft, it turned itself.
And that was the 1700s innovation?
I believe around 1700. Yeah. So before that, in Tudor times, quite possibly there was a sort of spit boy sitting or standing there turning a handle.
Endlessly. So we're leaving the kitchens. I think there's an artefact you want to show us that does have Tudor relevance.
Yes, we're going into the housekeeper's room, which was probably created in the 18th century for the housekeeper. It's created out of what was once a storeroom and a passageway. The passageway led from the kitchens straight through to the great hall.
Yes. And
so we think that a wall or a partition has been removed to give the housekeeper a pleasant office and sitting room. But we have this beautiful cup here. It's a silver gilt cup. It's known as the Godwin cup, which suggests that it dates from the 11th century because Earl Godwin, he was the father of King Harold, who was killed at the Battle of Hastings. He was one of the most influential and powerful people in late Anglo-Saxon England. But we don't think it did belong to him. It's covered in Tudor.
Yes, I can see that. It's got crowned Tudor rose, hasn't
it? Yes,
and
there's
the
portcullis. There's also a pineapple somewhere, I think.
I think it's here. I thought it was a thistle, but it doesn't.
There might be. Yes, it could be a thistle. So it's a bit of an enigma. It's said that there's an inscription around the inside. It's a lidded cup, a bit like a travelling communion cup, where you'd have the wafers in the top, and you'd give the wine in the chalice itself. It's said there's an inscription, or there was at one time, around the inside of the lid saying Earl Godwin drank from this cup. But we think that might have been a bit of kudos making. We know it went away to be restored for the 5th Earl's coming of age. That was in the 18th century. And it's now been dated and largely believed to date from the late Tudor period. Now, where it came from and how and why it came into the family, we don't really know. It's possible that it was one of the gifts by Henry Carey, Lord Hunsdon, to his granddaughter, who became Lady Berkeley. he left a lot of jewels to his granddaughter. They're known as the Hunsdon jewels, and they're not kept here. They're kept in the V&A in London. They're much too valuable to be kept here. So it's possible that it dates from then.
Because it's got lots of royal iconography, hasn't it? With the crowns. I mean, there's a crown on the top with the ball and the scepter, the crown scepter, not scepter.
There's a coat of arms on the top too.
Yes, there is a coat of arms. So I can see the royal, kind of the royal standard in there. So it's just got, with the crowned thistle and the crowned Tudor rose, it's just got everything that's saying...
portcullis, which was another of their icons.
The Beaufort portcullis. It's just screaming royal.
Tudor and royal.
Royal Tudor cup.
Now, we can meet Lord Hunsdon.
Yes, let's
Henry
do that.
Carey, in the Great Hall.
Let's do
He's
that.
waiting for us.
Now, we're going through this fabulous...
Mind the step.
Another gorgeous stone archway, which once led through into the service area and the kitchens. And then these huge oak doors lead us into this... Well, this is my favourite room, and you can probably hear the sound change as I walk in, because we've just come into the Great Hall of Berkeley, which, for my money, is one of the most fantastic Great Halls in England. And I've danced in here, and much to the pained ears of those people listening, even occasionally sang along to the odd Tudor ditty. The acoustics are amazing. It's one of the most amazing places to dance in.
Yeah, we have a lot of weddings here today, so this is one of the few rooms in the castle that's still sort of performing its original function for feasting and merriment and entertainment and so on. We have a beautiful screen, probably Tudor. It's not the original screen for the castle. When the 8th Earl came to live here in 1916, there was no screen, it had gone. So we don't know what the original screen was like. Maybe it had rotted, maybe it had been removed because screens were unfashionable in the Georgian period or something. But he wanted to recreate the medieval feel of the castle, and he found this beautiful painted screen in a manor house in South Wales. Oh, wow. And he brought it here and had it installed here. Nice. And hanging on the screen is a portrait of a gentleman, Henry Carey, Lord Hunsdon. Now, I'm sure you know his name.
Indeed I do.
Now, his mother was a lady called Mary Boleyn. And, of course, Mary had been a mistress of Henry VIII before he married her sister Anne. And many people believe that Henry Carey, who took the name of Mary's husband, was actually one of Henry VIII's illegitimate children. And looking at the portrait, kind of little beady eyes. Can't say whether he's got a reddish beard and reddish hair, but yes, there's a sort of family likeness.
He's got the Boleyn nose, I always think. It's quite a long nose.
Yes. But he was a favourite at court with Queen Elizabeth I. They were certainly first cousins. They may have been more than that. They may have been step-siblings. And he very largely grew up at court with Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth was on the throne, he became her Lord Chamberlain. Now, as Lord Chamberlain, he had the patronage of an acting troupe in London, which contained one William Shakespeare, because in the 1590s they were known as the Chamberlain's Men. His son, after his death in 1596, 1597, took on the patronage and the title of Lord Chamberlain. And then eventually, of course, King James I took over and they became known as the King's Men. So he would have known William Shakespeare, and his granddaughter, Elizabeth, married into the Berkeley family. She married Thomas Berkeley in 1596, not here in this great hall, but in London, and it's believed that A Midsummer Night's Dream was performed for the first time at their wedding.
Oh, how wonderful.
And it would have fitted, because he'd have known Shakespeare. He could have said, look, Will, my granddaughter's getting married. Can you just
pull something off?
Pen us a little play
Absolutely.
to entertain the guests.
Something light-hearted
Yeah,
and fun.
about marriage and, pitfalls and the ups and downs and courting.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
that's what we like to think, that A Midsummer Night's Dream was written for the Berkeley Carey wedding.
Fantastic. I love that.
And there's another portrait, well, there's a portrait next to who we think is Elizabeth Berkeley as a child, perhaps 10 or 11, can't be absolutely certain. And then another one, the other side of the double doors, of a rather severe-looking lady.
Dear, isn't she? You wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of her.
And if you remember the portrait in Drake's room of her, possibly her, acting in a mask, there's not really much connection between the two, is there? But we don't know.
How time
Elizabeth
changes.
Carey was a remarkable woman. She was very well educated. And she had a huge library of books. She was the original blue stocking, really. I mean, had there been universities for women, I think she'd have been there,
Really?
up at the front.
Oh, fantastic. What a great story. Now, let's just roll into thinking about royal visits. How many of the Tudor period, anyway? We've already talked potentially about 2 from Henry VII. I, of course, wrote about the 1535 progress of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, who came here. Any other royal visits from the Tudor period? You talked about Elizabeth I came here as well.
Oh, she came here in 1575. Yes, I think she had her eye on the castle because, of course, she didn't own it. When Berkeley Castle had been given to Henry VII, it had been given in male entail, which means that it only would belong to the Tudors as long as there were male heirs. And, of course, we all know that after Henry VIII, his son Edward VI only lived another 5 or 6 years and died young. And so, of course, then the castle was regained by the Berkeley family. I think Elizabeth was always a bit miffed
Was she?
that she didn't own it. She was a bit like her father. She liked possession. She liked owning places. And she didn't own this. She had a favourite, Dudley, and it's said that she really would have liked the castle to be able to give to him.
Oh, is that so?
I don't know how true that is, but it's a thought. So I think when she came, she wasn't an easy house guest. She made a bit of a nuisance of herself. She went hunting in the deer park, and it's said she shot 27 of Lord Berkeley's deer in one afternoon's sport. She probably took them away with her, I would imagine, to feed her great household.
No.
It's said that her baggage train arriving here was a mile long. So she came including the kitchen sink, I think.
Or never travelled lightly. It makes me feel fantastic about my packing. One of the things we talked earlier about archives, because one of the things that I stumbled across when I was researching was that there are, as you said, fantastic archives of Berkeley, but they're not so much for the 60 years when the royal family lived here. So do we know any more about what, for example, Henry VII or Henry VIII did while they were here at Berkeley?
Well, to be honest, I don't think they were here very much. It always amazes me how peripatetic even the Berkeleys were. The Berkeleys owned castles in all but 3 or 4 counties of England, manors and castles. So they were always moving around. And the crown, the kings were no different, I think. I mean, the number of properties that Henry VIII owned was a lot. And he couldn't be in them all at once. So I think they did just visit from time to time. They came for a country break, or if there was plague in London or Windsor or whatever, and so they would come to get away from it. So I don't suppose they really spent very much time here. But when they did come, they would have been entertained in this very hall,
in this very space
that we're standing in now.
Which is awesome. listening to the first part of this month's episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. The remainder of this episode is only available to members of my membership site, The Ultimate Guide to Exploring Tudor England. To join the waitlist to become a member of The Ultimate Guide, click on the link in the description associated with this podcast. You will be added to the waiting list and I will email you just as soon as the doors to the membership next reopen. I'll see you there. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. If you've loved the show, please take a moment to subscribe, like and rate this podcast so that we can spread the Tudor love. Until next time, my friends, all that remains for me to say is happy time travelling.